Classic Business. Law.
This evening in our feature, The Long Arm of Regulation, I'm joined in the studio by Cameron Dunstan-Smith, a director in Herbert Smith Freehills Corporate Crime and Investigations Practice. Cameron, good evening.
Evening, Chris.
You know, when I saw this this release here, I thought, by Jove, there really is no hiding place for the individual or corporate in this sort of situation. Is that a fair way of looking at things?
Yeah, I think that's quite a good way of putting it. It's getting more and more difficult in this day and age to get away with this type of thing. If you think you're in one jurisdiction and you've moved the money offshore, or your conduct happens somewhere else, that you won't be affected. That's not necessarily true. And even if you are a corporate operating in a country like South Africa, where we typically haven't had a very active enforcement history from a regulatory point of view, you may be caught up by a foreign regulator. So those are the types of issues we've sort of tried to address in this guide that we've prepared.
In this guide, I mean, I think there's something like 15 countries.
Yeah, we looked at 15 countries.
Yeah.
Throughout the globe. We've got 27 offices, and so we sort of pooled our expertise, and we thought it would be useful for our clients to see how you navigate an investigation that may involve multiple regulators in multiple jurisdictions.
Intuitively, I would have imagined, without being any kind of expert in this field at all, that the US would have had the most comprehensive and invasive type of legislation in this regard. Would that be correct?
They're generally the most active, so I'd say their jurisprudence and their history of dealing with these types of issues is more active than elsewhere. That's changing a little bit, but certainly that's not to say their legislation is necessarily better or more developed than elsewhere, but it's certainly enforced more, and so there's just more awareness, and the people actually conducting the investigations on the US government side are typically, a lot more sophisticated and advanced than regulators in other jurisdictions. And that's, it's a bit of a general statement, but that's not necessarily true for every country. But certainly they are the most, they're viewed as the most aggressive and the most active enforcers.
And why is that? I think of the film industry, for example. I mean, every time you watch a movie coming to the end, they say this is protected by the laws of the United States and other countries. Like other countries just are a bit of a side issue. America does seem to be just so pervasive in everything it does. Is it because it's just so powerful, it has so much money?
I think that's, for example, their SEC and their Department of Justice just have the resources to investigate these these types of issues. A place like here, where we've got a prosecuting authority that doesn't necessarily have, they've got a lot of other issues to deal with. So to attract the right people to deal with complex corporate criminal issues is difficult, and it's expensive for the government to run those types of investigations. And so the resources they have is one of the big reasons. They also, I think, they've historically tried to, and I'd say this is a bit unfair, to police activity around the globe. It was a bit unfair to them, but they have certainly enforced more than anyone else. And so if you just look at the top 10 corruption enforcement actions under their primary corruption legislation, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, only 2 of the top 10 companies that have been penalized under that act are US companies. The rest are foreign companies. The US has jurisdiction over them for one reason or another, and it's a very wide and far-reaching jurisdiction. So, as you said earlier, the ability to hide is quite tricky.
Yes. Apart from the US, which other countries in that 15 tend to prosecute and really go for people in a big way?
So the UK are increasing their activity in this space. That's been on the rise for a number of years now. I think post the financial crisis, everyone is a little more, I'm talking about the 2008 financial crisis, everyone is a little more interested and aware of making sure that, in particular, financial services companies and firms are behaving ethically and not doing things they shouldn't be doing. Australia has recently spend a lot of time and effort, their government spend a lot of time and effort looking at these types of issues in the financial regulatory space. And in the East as well, Singapore, Hong Kong, a lot of countries all around the world are increasing their activity in this space. So the US, I still think, are the yards, the country everyone's going to measure their activity against, and I think they'll be the front runners for a long time still. But other governments are upping their game.
And you mentioned the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I mean, what other elements of anti-corruption are we talking about? Things like anti-money laundering and this type of thing?
Yeah, so they all seem to go hand in hand. So if you are a company or an individual who is involved in a corrupt transaction in one space, you generally want to move the money to another space, and that'll throw in a fraud element or a money laundering element. So they sort of package together. The corrupt conduct may be the first piece in that puzzle, but then there's other ancillary offences and crimes that are that go hand in hand with that. And so then you'd be looking at different legislation, and this is in the financial services space. This is where, on the money laundering side of things, for example, where banks are used for money to be remitted around the world, and that's, I think, where they are having to look at these issues more closely, because it's just such a the world's getting smaller and smaller. The ability to move money around and to operate in different places more easily is increasing.
Well, on that point, and kind of expanding that, give me a feel for just how easy or difficult it is to actually get cooperation between different jurisdictions.
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, this guide that we've put together looks at all these issues about how governments and regulators cooperate with each other to try and assist each other in getting to the bottom of these types of allegations when they arise. And it depends, it varies from country to country. So privilege, for example, in the US and here, the UK, is pretty well entrenched in our legal system, and it's difficult, for example, to get privileged information. But in Japan and China, for example, privilege is not recognized at all. So that would be when a regulator is asking a regulator to pull information from a counterpart or a party in another country that they are seeking to find more out about. That would have an issue just from a privilege point of view. There's other issues as well. There's data protection and data privacy, which is becoming another issue that governments are having to look at more closely. So transmitting someone's personal data from one country to another country, they may have different data privacy and data protection laws. And so the cooperation element between the regulators will have to take all those issues into account. And there are various mutual legal assistance treaties and mutual legal cooperation treaties that different countries have. South Africa has a number of those sorts of arrangements with other countries. It just depends on where you are, which countries are talking to each other.
When you say privilege, I mean, we're talking about client lawyer privilege. In other words, the kind of invisible bond that exists between them, and you can't break that in some countries. But I'm intrigued that you mention that countries like Japan, that doesn't exist.
Yeah, so it's just it's the way their laws developed. And it's, I guess, I as a lawyer, I'd struggle to to understand how that works. But that's how they work over there, and so that would just be a different. You'd have to accept that you are not going to be able to have certain correspondences protected, and that is something that people would, I think, find quite difficult in countries where they do recognize privilege.
So at this particular juncture, how successful has this whole exercise been, and how is it going to develop in future, do you think?
Are you talking about cooperation generally between?
Exactly. Yes.
So I think it's definitely improving. As you mentioned earlier, the US have been the front runners, and as more and more countries start being more active themselves, I think the cooperation between governments and regulators will increase, particularly when the more active regulators start seeing and start having confidence that regulators in other countries are taking things more seriously and being more active. I think the cooperation will increase between the regulators.
Cameron Dunstan-Smith, Director at Herbert Smith Freehills Corporate Crime and Investigating Practice, many, many thanks for your valued input.
Thanks, Chris.